Some people spend their entire lives searching for love, but the coldest man in Chicago had spent 10 years running from it, and on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, the only thing standing between his carefully guarded heart and the truth was a simple black maid who refused to keep what did not belong to her. Naomi Brooks lowered her umbrella as the wind swept through the massive iron gates of Romano Estate, sending silver droplets dancing across the stone driveway polished by decades of wealth. She had worked there for only 12 days, long enough to learn the unwritten rules every employee whispered about during lunch breaks. Never interrupt Mr. Ethan Romano. Never ask questions about the visitors arriving in black luxury SUVs. And never wander beyond the eastern gardens where the old fountain stood beneath towering oak trees. Those rules had kept everyone employed. Breaking them usually ended careers before sunset. Yet this morning, the storm had scattered branches across the property, and Sophia, the head housekeeper, had quietly assigned Naomi to clear the garden paths before guests arrived for an afternoon business meeting. She welcomed the solitude. The gardens were peaceful compared to the endless marble hallways inside the mansion, where silence seemed heavier than the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. Naomi adjusted her work gloves and bent to gather fallen branches, her boots sinking slightly into the damp grass. The rain softened into a gentle mist, and somewhere beyond the hedges, a lonely robin sang despite the gray sky. She smiled faintly. Her grandmother used to say honest people could always hear birds after storms because their hearts never forgot hope. Naomi still believed that, even after life had given her more reasons to doubt than to trust. As she reached beneath a rose bush to retrieve a broken limb, something caught the faint morning light. It wasn't a raindrop. It wasn't a piece of glass. It was a ring. She carefully brushed away the wet soil with trembling fingertips. Platinum. Heavy. Impossibly elegant. A deep blue sapphire rested at its center, surrounded by tiny diamonds that shimmered even beneath the clouds. Naomi had never held jewelry like this before. It looked less like an accessory and more like a family story forged into precious metal. She glanced around the empty garden. No one was nearby. The estate stretched across acres of private land, quiet except for distant thunder fading toward Lake Michigan. Her pulse quickened as another thought crossed her mind. That single ring was probably worth more than everything she owned. It could cover her mother's overdue medical bills. It could replace the leaking roof above her apartment. It could finally erase the debt collectors calling every evening after work. For one impossible second, reality and temptation stood face to face. Then Naomi closed her hand around the ring and gently exhaled. "Someone must be looking for you," she whispered, almost speaking to the ring itself. There was never another choice. Not really. Her mother had raised her on a simple belief that dignity was worth more than comfort, and peace was something money could never purchase. Naomi slipped the ring carefully into the small pocket inside her apron, not to hide it, but to protect it from the rain until she found its owner. She had no idea that dozens of security cameras had already recorded the moment she picked it up. She had no idea that somewhere inside the mansion, one of the most feared men in America had just discovered the only object he treasured above power had disappeared. And she certainly had no idea that before this day ended, returning a lost ring would quietly begin changing two lives forever. Inside the Romano mansion, silence was never peaceful. It carried weight, discipline, and expectations that every employee learned to respect before the end of their first week. Naomi Brooks stepped through the service entrance, carefully wiping the rain from her shoes before crossing the polished marble floor. The small pocket inside her apron suddenly felt much heavier than before. She could almost feel the outline of the sapphire ring resting against the fabric, reminding her with every step that someone inside this enormous estate had already begun searching for it. The kitchen bustled with quiet efficiency as chefs prepared lunch for important visitors, but the usual rhythm was broken by anxious whispers. Two security officers moved quickly through the hallways speaking into discreet earpieces while another reviewed camera footage on a tablet near the entrance. Even Sophia, who rarely allowed emotion to appear on her composed face, looked unusually tense. Everyone stop what you are doing for a moment, she announced calmly, although her voice carried a strain Naomi had never heard before. Every maid, gardener, and butler gathered near the service corridor. A personal item belonging to Mr. Ethan Romano has gone missing. Security will handle the search. If anyone has seen anything unusual this morning, report it immediately. No assumptions. No accusations. Just honesty. The room became perfectly still. Naomi instinctively touched the edge of her apron but quickly lowered her hand before anyone noticed. She stepped forward, intending to explain, but another employee spoke first, describing a delivery truck that had entered earlier that morning. Security immediately shifted their attention toward the loading dock, and the meeting dissolved into organized confusion. Naomi watched them disappear before quietly releasing the breath she had been holding. She did not want to interrupt without knowing whether the ring truly belonged to Mr. Romano. If it belonged to a guest, returning it to the wrong person would only create more problems. She decided there was only one sensible choice. She would ask Sophia privately as soon as the opportunity appeared. Upstairs, behind solid walnut doors overlooking Lake Michigan, Ethan Romano stood alone beside floor-to-ceiling windows streaked with rain. At 35, he had built a reputation that newspapers endlessly exaggerated and competitors quietly respected. Business magazines admired his discipline. Society pages speculated about his fortune. Gossip columns obsessed over a single mystery that never seemed to change. Every year, influential families introduced accomplished, elegant women hoping to become part of the Romano legacy, and every year Ethan politely declined. He never embarrassed anyone. He simply never accepted. Some believed he was impossible to satisfy. Others assumed he valued work above everything else. None of them knew the truth hidden inside a small velvet box that had remained locked in his private study for more than a decade. Today, that box sat open on his desk. Empty. Ethan rested one hand against the polished wood without speaking. His executive assistant stood several feet away, waiting for instructions that did not come. Finally Ethan looked toward the security monitor displaying the eastern gardens. "Have the cameras found anything?" he asked quietly. "We are reviewing every angle, sir," the assistant replied. "No confirmed answers yet." Ethan nodded once. He showed no anger, no panic, no visible disappointment. Years of discipline had taught him never to reveal emotions before facts. Yet after the assistant left, his composure slipped just enough for his gaze to linger on the empty velvet lining. The sapphire ring had belonged to his mother. It was the last gift she ever placed into his hands before illness quietly took her away. She had smiled, closed his fingers around the ring, and told him that the right person would never measure love by wealth, power, or status. Those words had followed him through every success, every celebration, and every lonely evening inside the mansion that seemed far larger than one man could ever need. Outside, the rain finally stopped. A thin beam of sunlight pushed through the clouds and illuminated the gardens where the ring had disappeared only hours earlier. At almost the same moment, Naomi walked toward Sophia's office with careful determination, completely unaware that every decision she made over the next few minutes would begin unraveling a story neither she nor Ethan had ever imagined. Naomi paused outside Sophia's office after finding the door slightly open, but before she could knock, two members of the security team hurried past carrying tablets filled with surveillance images. Their expressions were controlled, yet unmistakably urgent. One of them stopped when he noticed Naomi standing in the hallway. "You," he said firmly without raising his voice. "Where were you working this morning?" Naomi answered honestly, describing the eastern gardens, the fallen branches, and the storm cleanup exactly as it had happened. The officer exchanged a quick glance with his colleague before asking, "Did you notice anything unusual?" Naomi reached into her apron with slow, careful movements and revealed the sapphire ring resting in her open palm. Light from the nearby windows scattered across the polished stone walls as the deep blue gemstone caught the afternoon sun. Neither officer spoke for several long seconds. Their surprise was not loud. It was the kind of silence that immediately changed the atmosphere around them. "I found it beneath the rose bushes," Naomi explained quietly. "I wanted to ask Miss Sophia who it belonged to before giving it to anyone else." One officer carefully accepted the ring without taking his eyes off Naomi. "Come with us." There was no accusation in his voice, yet the words still caused her heartbeat to quicken. She nodded without hesitation. Truth had nothing to fear. Together they walked through hallways Naomi had never entered before. The polished marble gradually gave way to darker hardwood floors, rich walnut walls, and framed photographs that revealed moments the public had never seen. A young Ethan standing beside his parents on a sailboat. A family Christmas in front of an enormous fireplace. A smiling woman with gentle blue eyes wearing the very same sapphire ring now resting inside the security officer's gloved hand. Naomi slowed for only a heartbeat before continuing forward. She suddenly understood that this ring was never simply expensive jewelry. It belonged to someone's memories. They stopped outside a pair of tall double doors. One officer knocked once before opening them. Ethan Romano remained standing beside the windows overlooking Lake Michigan, his hands resting calmly behind his back. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the water, casting soft silver patterns across the room, yet nothing seemed brighter than the sapphire now resting on his desk as the officer carefully placed it before him. "Sir," he said respectfully, "the ring has been recovered." Ethan's eyes lowered toward the familiar piece of jewelry. For the first time that day, a nearly invisible breath escaped his lips. Not relief exactly. Something quieter. Something deeper. Then his gaze shifted toward Naomi. She stood several feet away with her hands folded neatly in front of her apron, shoulders relaxed despite the intimidating surroundings. She did not lower her eyes from fear, nor did she stare from curiosity. She simply waited. Ethan studied her longer than he intended. She looked younger than he expected, perhaps 27, dressed in the simple uniform every house employee wore. Rain had left a few tiny curls escaping near her forehead, and faint traces of dirt remained along one sleeve from clearing the gardens. She appeared completely ordinary, yet nothing about this moment felt ordinary. Finally he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and almost impossibly composed. "Why did you not sell it?" The question lingered between them. Naomi blinked once, surprised less by the question itself than by the assumption hidden inside it. She looked briefly toward the sapphire before meeting Ethan's eyes again. "Because it was never mine," she answered softly. "Someone was probably worried the moment they realized it was gone. I could not imagine adding to that pain." The room became perfectly still. No one reached for a tablet. No one cleared a throat. Even the security officers seemed to forget they were present. Ethan continued looking at Naomi without speaking. Over the years he had heard countless polished speeches from executives, attorneys, politicians, and socialites who always seemed to know exactly what he wanted to hear. Yet this simple maid had answered without calculation, without hesitation, and without expecting anything in return. For reasons he could not yet explain, those 8 quiet words echoed far louder than any business negotiation he had ever won. No one inside the study moved after Naomi finished speaking. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt unfamiliar, as though the room itself had paused to examine words so simple they could not possibly carry such weight. Ethan Romano lowered his eyes to the sapphire ring resting on the polished walnut desk. His fingertips brushed the cool platinum for only a second before he closed the velvet box with deliberate care. The soft click echoed through the spacious office more clearly than anyone expected. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. She had not returned the ring hoping for praise, or reward, or even gratitude. In her mind, the matter had already ended the moment it was safely back with its owner. Ethan slowly looked up again. There was something different in the way he studied her now. Earlier, he had seen another employee wearing the same uniform as dozens of others inside the estate. Now he noticed details that had escaped him before. The faint calluses on her hands from years of honest work. The careful way she stood without pretending to be confident or shrinking into fear. The quiet steadiness in her eyes that never searched the room for approval. It reminded him of someone he had not allowed himself to remember in years. His mother had possessed that same calm certainty. She had always believed character revealed itself most clearly when no one was watching. Ethan had spent the last decade meeting people who admired influence, wealth, or reputation long before they ever tried to understand the man standing behind them. One by one, they all disappointed him. Some chased prestige. Others chased comfort. A few simply wanted to become part of the Romano name. Eventually, refusing everyone became easier than wondering who might be genuine. He had convinced himself that trust belonged to another lifetime. Yet standing only a few feet away was a woman who had unknowingly carried something priceless through an empty garden without ever imagining it could become hers. She had protected it because it mattered to someone else. That simple truth quietly unsettled everything he believed about people. "What is your name?" Ethan asked, although he already knew the answer from the employee records. "Naomi Brooks, sir." "How long have you worked here?" 12 days. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. 12 days. Not 12 years. She had barely become familiar with the mansion, yet she had already demonstrated more honesty than some individuals he had trusted for decades in business. One of the security officers shifted slightly before speaking. "Sir, we reviewed the footage." Miss Brooks picked up the ring immediately after the storm. She placed it inside her apron and continued clearing the gardens for another 43 minutes before attempting to report it. Ethan glanced briefly toward the officer before returning his attention to Naomi. "You never tried to leave the property?" "No, sir." "You never asked anyone what it was worth?" "No, sir." "You never considered keeping it?" Naomi answered with complete sincerity. "For a moment, I wondered how much it might help my family. Then I remembered it was helping someone else long before I found it." Ethan felt those words settle somewhere deeper than reason. Most people would have hidden such an admission, afraid it might make them appear weak or tempted. Naomi had offered the truth without decorating it. She admitted the struggle instead of pretending it never existed. Somehow that honesty carried even greater value than perfect behavior. Outside the windows, sunlight finally broke through the last gray clouds, filling the study with warm afternoon light that softened the dark wood and rich leather surrounding them. Ethan looked once more at the velvet box before quietly sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Thank you, Miss Brooks," he said. The word sounded almost unfamiliar leaving his lips. Employees across the estate often thanked him. Very few had ever heard him thank them. Naomi offered a gentle smile that carried neither excitement nor relief, only quiet kindness. "I am glad it found its way home." As she turned to leave the study, Ethan watched the door close behind her and realized something that surprised him more than losing the ring itself. For the first time in 10 years, the object his mother had treasured no longer felt like the most valuable thing that had crossed his path that day. That evening, after the last of the business guests had departed and the mansion settled into its familiar silence, Ethan Romano unlocked the small walnut cabinet that no one else in the estate had permission to touch. Hidden inside was an old leather journal, a faded family photograph, and an empty velvet box that had remained open for most of the afternoon. He gently removed the sapphire ring from his jacket pocket and placed it back where it belonged. For several quiet moments, he simply looked at it without speaking. The polished gemstone reflected the warm glow of a single desk lamp, and with it came memories he had spent years teaching himself not to revisit. He was 25 again, standing beside a hospital window while snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago. His mother had looked noticeably weaker than she had only a month before, yet her smile remained unchanged. She had slipped the ring from her finger, closed his hand around it, and spoken with remarkable calm. "One day, many people will admire your success, Ethan," she had whispered. "Some will admire your name. Some will admire your money. But the person worthy of walking beside you will be the one who values neither. Keep this ring until you meet someone who protects what matters even when no one is watching. At the time, Ethan believed those words were simply the gentle hopes of a loving mother. Years later, after endless introductions, elegant charity galas, carefully arranged dinners, and polished conversations that all seemed to revolve around influence rather than sincerity, those words became something much larger. They became a promise. Every proposal quietly presented by respected families. Every carefully planned relationship encouraged by trusted advisors. Every opportunity to build alliances through marriage. Ethan declined them all with courtesy that never invited explanation. Newspapers described him as distant. Television commentators called him emotionally unavailable. Society magazines invented romances that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. None of them knew that every invitation was measured against one silent question his mother had left behind. Would this person still choose kindness if no one could see? Year after year, the answer never felt certain. Gradually, the search itself became exhausting. It seemed easier to believe that genuine people belonged to another generation, one that valued integrity more than appearance. Earlier that afternoon, however, an employee wearing a simple housekeeping uniform had quietly unsettled a belief that had taken 10 years to build. Naomi Brooks had not known whose ring she carried. She had not known cameras observed her every step. She had not expected gratitude, recognition, or reward. She had simply chosen honesty because, in her mind, honesty required no audience. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. He could still hear her answer as clearly as if she were standing in front of him. Because it was never mine. Such ordinary words. Yet somehow they carried extraordinary weight. Across the estate, Naomi sat alone in the modest staff dining room finishing a simple bowl of vegetable soup before beginning her evening bus ride home. She had no idea her quiet decision continued echoing inside the mansion. She was thinking about completely different concerns. Her mother's physical therapy appointment scheduled for Friday. The overdue electric bill waiting on the kitchen counter. Whether she could afford new shoes before winter arrived. Returning the ring had never felt heroic. It had simply felt right. Sophia entered the dining room carrying a folder of work schedules before pausing beside Naomi's table. "Miss Brooks," she said with a gentle smile, "Mr. Romano asked me to thank you once again for your honesty." Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "I already returned what belonged to him." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is exactly why he keeps thanking you." Naomi smiled politely, although she did not fully understand what Sophia meant. Outside, the lights of the Romano mansion reflected across the calm surface of Lake Michigan, while inside his study Ethan carefully closed the cabinet and quietly realized something he had not allowed himself to believe for a very long time. Perhaps his mother's promise had never been impossible. Perhaps he had simply been searching in all the wrong places. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight that spilled across the Romano estate, turning the marble walkways into ribbons of gold. From the outside, everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. Gardeners trimmed hedges with careful precision. Housekeepers polished windows until they reflected the blue sky. Luxury sedans rolled quietly through the front gates according to schedules that rarely changed. Yet inside the mansion, one thing was different. Ethan Romano noticed Naomi Brooks everywhere without intending to. He saw her carrying fresh linens through the west corridor before sunrise. He noticed the way she paused to straighten a painting that had shifted slightly on the wall even though no one had asked her to. He watched from the second-floor balcony as she gently moved a small bird's nest from a pile of trimmed branches to the safety of a nearby tree instead of throwing it away with the yard waste. None of those moments were extraordinary on their own. Together, however, they formed a picture he could not ignore. They were the kind of quiet choices that never appeared in headlines, never earned applause, and never expected recognition. They simply revealed character. Ethan found himself wondering whether the honesty she had shown with the sapphire ring had been a single remarkable moment or merely the natural extension of who she truly was. Curiosity, he reminded himself, was not the same as trust. Experience had taught him that first impressions could be misleading. Even sincere gestures deserved time before becoming beliefs. Late that morning, he called Daniel Harper, the longtime director of estate operations, into his study. Daniel had managed the household for nearly 15 years and knew every employee by name. "Tell me about Miss Brooks," Ethan said without looking away from the financial report spread across his desk. Daniel seemed mildly surprised by the question. "She has been with us less than 2 weeks, sir. Excellent attendance. Quiet. Respectful. She volunteers for extra work without being asked. The staff speaks well of her." Ethan remained silent for a moment before asking another question. "Any complaints?" "None." "Any requests for special treatment?" "None." Daniel smiled faintly. "In fact, yesterday she apologized for accidentally taking an extra apple from the kitchen because she thought it belonged to another employee. She brought it back before anyone noticed." Ethan slowly closed the folder in front of him. Most people never imagined that tiny decisions mattered. They believed integrity was measured only during dramatic moments. His mother had always believed the opposite. Character lived inside ordinary habits repeated every day. After Daniel left, Ethan walked toward the library overlooking the gardens below. Through the tall windows he spotted Naomi dusting bookshelves with quiet concentration. She handled every old volume carefully, aligning each spine before moving to the next shelf. An elderly groundskeeper entered carrying a heavy box of flower bulbs. Before he could ask for help, Naomi immediately crossed the room, accepted nearly half the weight, and smiled as they carried the box together toward the greenhouse. The older man laughed at something she quietly said, and for the first time Ethan realized he had never seen anyone inside the estate appear uncomfortable around her. She did not command attention. She created ease. That afternoon, Ethan made a decision he did not fully explain even to himself. He instructed the accounting office to assign Naomi to the main residence permanently instead of rotating her between guest properties. Officially, the change reflected staffing needs. Unofficially, he wanted the opportunity to observe whether kindness remained constant over time or faded once no important moment remained. Naomi received the updated schedule from Sophia just before ending her shift. "You have been reassigned to the main house," Sophia said warmly. Mr. Romano approved it personally. Naomi blinked in surprise. "Did I do something wrong?" Sophia laughed softly. "No, Miss Brooks. Sometimes life changes because someone notices that you keep doing the right thing when you believe no one is paying attention." Naomi accepted the schedule with quiet gratitude, completely unaware that the man whose trust had remained locked away for 10 long years had begun opening the smallest corner of it, not because of one extraordinary act, but because every ordinary day afterward continued telling exactly the same story. 3 days passed, and the quiet rhythm of the Romano estate continued with almost perfect precision, yet Ethan Romano found himself paying attention to details he had ignored for years. He had spent most of his adult life evaluating people through contracts, negotiations, and carefully prepared meetings, but Naomi Brooks revealed herself through moments so ordinary that almost everyone else overlooked them. She greeted every employee with the same warmth whether they managed the estate or swept the front steps. She thanked the kitchen staff before every meal. She quietly repaired a loose button on an elderly gardener's uniform instead of pointing it out and leaving the problem for someone else. None of those gestures cost money. They simply required kindness. Ethan wondered whether such consistency could truly exist without expectation. Experience urged caution. His heart, however, had begun asking questions his mind could no longer silence. One Thursday afternoon, while reviewing renovation plans for one of the guest houses, an unexpected thought entered his mind. It was not born from suspicion alone. It was born from uncertainty. He needed to know whether Naomi's honesty belonged only to moments when the right choice seemed obvious or whether it remained unchanged when no one could ever know. He quietly called Daniel Harper into his office and gave a simple instruction. Place a leather portfolio in the East Library before closing. Inside, leave $50,000 in cash and a signed property contract. Make certain no cameras are visible from the room. Do not tell anyone why. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He had worked for Ethan long enough to understand that some questions were answered only through patience. Late that afternoon, Naomi entered the East Library carrying fresh flowers for the reading tables. Golden sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the room with a peaceful glow. As she arranged white lilies inside a crystal vase, she noticed the dark leather portfolio resting alone on a reading desk. She looked around the empty room. No one appeared to be nearby. Curious, she stepped closer and saw the edge of neatly stacked bills visible beneath the slightly open cover. She immediately closed it without counting. Anything. Her first instinct was not excitement. It was concern. Someone important must have forgotten something valuable. She carried the portfolio with both hands, as carefully as if it contained fragile glass, and walked directly toward Daniel's office. "Excuse me," she said softly after knocking. "I think someone left this in the library." Daniel accepted the portfolio without opening it. "Did you look inside?" Naomi answered honestly. "Only enough to realize it was not mine." "You did not wonder how much money was there?" She smiled gently. "Enough that whoever lost it is probably having a very stressful afternoon." Daniel could not help smiling in return. "Thank you, Miss Brooks." Naomi returned to her duties without another word, never realizing Ethan had been watching quietly through the narrow glass panel beside the hallway. He had expected honesty. What surprised him was something even greater. She had shown no struggle this time. No hesitation. The decision had become effortless because it reflected who she truly was. That evening Daniel placed the untouched portfolio on Ethan's desk. "Every dollar is still there," he said. She never counted it. She never asked whose it was. She simply returned it. Ethan rested his hand lightly on the leather cover before closing his eyes for a brief moment. Years of disappointment had taught him to search for hidden motives in every generous act. Yet each day Naomi quietly dismantled another piece of that habit without realizing she was doing so. She was not trying to impress him. She was not pursuing favor. She was simply living according to principles that remained steady whether someone was watching or not. As twilight settled across Lake Michigan and the first evening lights illuminated the estate, Ethan looked toward the library where the forgotten portfolio had rested only hours before. The test had never been about money. It had been about trust. For the first time in many years, he no longer questioned whether people like Naomi existed. He questioned why he had spent so long believing they did not. The annual Romano Foundation reception arrived on a clear Saturday evening, filling the mansion with respected business leaders, community partners, and longtime family acquaintances. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across the grand ballroom while a string quartet played softly from the balcony above. Every table had been arranged with perfect precision, every flower positioned by hand, every detail reflecting the quiet elegance that had become synonymous with the Romano name. Naomi Brooks spent the afternoon helping prepare the reception, carefully placing fresh white roses in silver vases and ensuring each guest room was ready before the first arrivals appeared. She preferred working behind the scenes. Watching successful people celebrate from a respectful distance had never bothered her. She believed every honest job carried dignity, whether someone stood beneath the chandeliers or polished the floors beneath them. As the evening progressed, Sophia asked Naomi to bring a replacement set of embroidered linen napkins to the ballroom after an accidental coffee spill at one of the head tables. Carrying the neatly folded linens, Naomi entered quietly, hoping to complete the task without interrupting the conversations around her. Just as she reached the table, a sharply dressed woman in an elegant ivory gown noticed her. Her name was Victoria Sinclair, the daughter of one of the city's most influential families and someone many guests had quietly expected Ethan Romano to marry someday. Although no engagement had ever existed, rumors had followed them for years. Victoria glanced toward the sapphire ring visible inside the small display case placed beside several family photographs that honored the Romano Foundation's history. Her expression changed almost instantly. "Wait," she said, loud enough for nearby conversations to stop. Her eyes shifted toward Naomi. "Is this the same maid who found Mr. Romano's family ring?" Several guests turned with polite curiosity. Naomi nodded gently. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria offered a pleasant smile that never reached her eyes. "Interesting. Then perhaps you can also explain why one of my diamond earrings disappeared shortly after you entered the ballroom." The room became noticeably quieter. Naomi blinked in confusion. "I am sorry, but I have not seen your earring." Victoria folded her arms gracefully. "Are you certain? It would not be the first valuable item to pass through your hands." A few uncomfortable glances moved between the guests. No one spoke. Naomi held the folded linens a little tighter but kept her voice calm. "If something is missing, I hope it is found quickly. I would be happy to help search." Victoria stepped closer. "That sounds very generous. Perhaps we should begin by checking your apron." The suggestion hung heavily in the room. Naomi neither argued nor became defensive. She simply answered with quiet dignity. "If that helps everyone feel at ease, you may." Before anyone could move, another voice entered the silence. "That will not be necessary." Every head turned toward the entrance. Ethan Romano crossed the ballroom at an unhurried pace, his expression composed, his posture relaxed, yet his presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. He stopped beside Naomi instead of across from her. It was a small distance, barely a few feet, but everyone noticed exactly where he chose to stand. His eyes rested briefly on Victoria before returning to the guests gathered nearby. "Miss Brooks has already demonstrated the kind of honesty that cannot be measured by appearances or assumptions," he said evenly. "I will not allow anyone under my roof to be judged without evidence." Victoria attempted a polite laugh. "I only wanted to recover my earring." Ethan nodded once. "And we will." He turned toward Daniel Harper. "Please review the ballroom cameras from the last 30 minutes. Less than 5 minutes later, the footage revealed the missing earring resting beneath the edge of Victoria's own chair where it had slipped unnoticed onto the carpet. Daniel carefully retrieved it and returned it without a single unnecessary comment. A quiet wave of embarrassment moved through the room. Victoria accepted the earring with an uneasy smile before murmuring an apology to Naomi. Naomi simply answered, "I am glad it was found." There was no bitterness in her voice, no satisfaction, only genuine relief that the misunderstanding had ended. Ethan watched her response with silent admiration. Most people defended themselves by humiliating the person who had doubted them. Naomi chose grace instead. As conversation slowly resumed beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, many guests no longer remembered the missing earring. They remembered something far more lasting. They remembered the moment the most reserved man in the room had chosen to protect the dignity of a housekeeper without hesitation, and a quiet woman who responded to public doubt not with anger, but with kindness. The reception ended long after the final guests had departed, leaving the Romano mansion wrapped once again in peaceful silence. Staff members quietly cleared crystal glasses and folded linen tablecloths while the last notes from the string quartet faded into memory. Naomi Brooks carried a tray toward the kitchen, believing the evening had finally come to an end, when Sophia gently approached her with an unexpected message. "Mr. Romano would like to see you in the library before you leave." Naomi nodded politely, wondering whether another assignment awaited her. She knocked softly before stepping inside. The library was warmly lit by a crackling fireplace, its shelves lined with generations of leather-bound books that carried the history of the Romano family. Ethan Romano stood beside the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens where everything had quietly begun only days earlier. He turned as Naomi entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt intimidating. It felt thoughtful. Ethan walked toward the desk and carefully placed a small velvet box upon its polished surface. Naomi immediately recognized it. "This belongs to your family," she said gently. Ethan smiled faintly, the smallest smile she had ever seen on his face. "It does," he answered. "And because of you, it still does." He slowly opened the box, revealing the sapphire ring resting inside exactly as his mother had once worn it. The gemstone reflected the firelight with quiet elegance. Ethan looked at it for a long moment before lifting his eyes to Naomi. "For 10 years, I believed this ring represented a promise I could never fulfill," he said calmly. "I spent those years believing every person who came into my life wanted what surrounded it instead of what it meant." Naomi listened without interrupting. Ethan continued, his voice steady but softer than it had ever been. "When you found this ring, you did not know my name. You did not know its history. You only knew it belonged to someone else." He gently closed the velvet box again. "You returned far more than a family heirloom. You returned something I thought had disappeared long before the ring was ever lost." Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. "What was that?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Trust." The single word settled gently into the room. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment before smiling with genuine warmth. "My grandmother always said trust grows the same way gardens do. One honest choice at a time." Ethan quietly laughed, surprising even himself. It was not the restrained smile expected from a powerful businessman. It was the natural laugh of someone remembering how hope sounded. He reached into a folder resting beside the velvet box and handed Naomi a neatly prepared envelope. Inside was a letter confirming a promotion to estate operations coordinator, along with a scholarship established through the Romano Foundation that would fully cover her mother's physical therapy expenses and provide Naomi with tuition assistance if she ever wished to continue her education. Naomi looked up in astonishment. "Sir, this is too much." Ethan gently shook his head. "No. It is an investment in someone who has already proven the value of character." Naomi carefully closed the envelope. "Thank you. I will work hard to deserve it." Ethan answered with complete sincerity. "You already have." Outside, the moon reflected across the calm waters of Lake Michigan just as it had reflected across the rain-soaked gardens a few days earlier when a simple act of honesty quietly changed 2 lives. The sapphire ring remained safely inside the Romano family collection, exactly where it belonged, but Ethan no longer saw it as the greatest treasure his mother had left behind. Her true gift had been the wisdom to recognize integrity when it finally appeared. As Naomi stepped out of the library and into the softly lit hallway, she carried nothing more valuable than the same quiet dignity she had possessed from the beginning. Money had not changed her. Recognition had not changed her. Kindness had simply revealed who she had always been. Ethan watched the door close gently behind her before turning once more toward the moonlit gardens. For the first time in many years, the vast mansion no longer felt empty. It felt hopeful. And that night, without speeches, without grand celebrations, and without anyone trying to prove a point, 2 people from completely different worlds reminded everyone who witnessed their story that the strongest foundation any life can be built upon is not wealth, status, or power, but the quiet courage to do what is right even when no one is watching. And on that peaceful night, dignity found its way home.